You are a municipal court judge in 1989, and every day one of your first morning tasks is to set bail for people who were arrested the night before. But on this morning, before you start work, some researchers have asked you to write down your thoughts on a particular topic. For 10 minutes, you write about that topic, and then you turn to the task of setting bails for two sex workers who were picked up the previous night. Now, there are about a dozen judges doing this in their various chambers for the study. Another dozen or so serve as a control group. They turn to the task of setting bails without doing that writing assignment beforehand. All of you are assessing sex workers in similar circumstances, and the control group ends up setting bail for the sex workers at about $50 on average. But your group, those who reflected on the assigned topic in advance, set bail for the same offense at an average of $445, 9 times the control group average. Okay. Another study, subjects who reflected on that same topic responded more strongly afterwards in defense of cultural symbols and heroes than the control group. Another study, subjects who reflected on the same topic later showed a greater desire for material possessions. In other studies with the same prompt, they showed a greater tendency toward charitable giving, but only toward members of their own racial or national identity. They were more likely to apply negative stereotypes to people of other identities. They tried harder on intelligence tests after the prompt. They were more concerned with personal appearance, expressed a stronger desire to leave a legacy behind them, and they felt angrier about those who disrespect their nation or their values. Now, as you might have guessed from the title of my talk, the prompt that produced this incredible array of outcomes is death. Subjects who reflect on mortality, especially their own, are more likely to judge moral transgressions harshly, like the judges with the sex workers, to rally around cultural symbols, to hoard wealth, to boost markers of self-esteem, to favor in-group members, and to denigrate out-group members. Since the mid-1980s, more than 500 of these studies have contributed to a psychological model called terror management theory, or TMT. Here's the central thesis. Among animals, humans possess a unique awareness of their inevitable death. This creates the potential for overwhelming existential terror. To manage this anxiety, people rely on elements of self-esteem and culture, which you might call group esteem. These provide psychological buffers against death awareness. Conscious awareness of death, which the researchers call mortality salience, increases the defense of self-esteem and cultural values, which temporarily pushes the awareness of death back into the subconscious. It's never gone, but it's less salient. Now, I majored in physical anthropology at Berkeley so that I could understand how evolution works. I wanted to gain a better understanding of why we are the way we are. And most recently, it's been helpful in providing ultimate explanations for the MAGA movement. And we're all trying to sort that out right now. We spent some time over there working on it. But most of the attempts I ever hear at understanding what's going on are what's called proximate explanations, not ultimate. So an example of that. If you ask why birds migrate south in the winter, and I say, well, it's because changes in daylight alter their hormone levels and trigger that behavior. That's true. That's what happens. But that's a proximate cause, right? That's a description of the mechanism operating in the present. An ultimate answer, in this case, would describe why that mechanism exists in the bird. So in organic systems, natural selection tends to provide ultimate answers. Birds move to warmer climates in winter and therefore survive and reproduce at higher rates. That's an ultimate answer. That tells us why the mechanism is there. Why do humans jump when you hear a rustle in the bushes, right? Proximate answer, the amygdala and the brainstem trigger this startle response. It's true. But the ultimate answer is those whose nervous systems responded that way were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing that tendency on. So the question of our time, I think, is why does Donald Trump enjoy a core of unrelenting support that seems impervious to contrary evidence? And we say, well, that's what religious thinking gets you, right? So many of his supporters are religious. That's what religious thinking gets you. Or I hear the racists found their guy, right? If you're a racist and then you got this guy, there's your guy. Or if you're a misogynist, the misogynists found their guy. Those things are all true, but they're all proximate answers. We shouldn't be satisfied with proximate answers. Yes, MAGA is full of racists and misogynists and religionists. Yes. But how did those things get into those heads? Now, when I ask that question, I tend to hear the same pat answer all the time, which is they're taught. Those things are taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. That's from South Pacific, right? And that lyric implies that the human mind arrives at the teaching moment as a blank slate, right? And then racial animus or sexism or supernatural beliefs are written on that blank slate. There is essentially no remaining substantial support in the scientific community for that idea of the blank slate. Yes, the mind of a child is malleable. That's absolutely true. But it brings with it an evolved set of predispositions on which environmental factors work, including teaching. So a better description of the current understanding is that all of us bring these tendencies with us. And one such tendency is something called coalition tracking. This is a cognitive process that leads us to quickly detect, categorize, and monitor social alliances. Who's on our team, right? How we define those lines is often determined by environment. So what turns coalition tracking into racism and xenophobia? TMT researchers point to mortality salience, the bringing of our shared recognition of mortality into consciousness. Coalition tracking inclines us toward a fear of difference. That's actually something that is evolutionary, toward racism and xenophobia, making it closer to the default. We've developed the tools to improve on these tendencies. That's a big part of what civilization is about, is improving on natural tendencies. But not everyone has equal access to those tools. I'll get to that in just a minute. And we think of religious belief and the promise of an afterlife as an obvious response to mortality salience, right? That's what it's all about. Ultimately, religion answered the biggest human need, which is to not die. Well, it turns out you don't. You go on forever, right? But TMT researchers have gone way beyond that to link death awareness to a staggering array of human behaviors, such as increased nationalism, devotion to political ideologies, attachment to moral systems, identification with historical traditions, obsessions with high achievement, fame, legacy, productivity, career ambition, artistic creation and scientific discovery, getting married, having kids, having affairs, accumulating wealth, the desire for control, order, certainty, strong in-group identification and out-group hostility, a strong preference for clear categories, race, gender, sexual orientation, acts of distraction and numbing, scrolling, building a social media persona, body adornment, fashion, tattoos. All of these have been linked by TMT studies to an increase in death anxiety and awareness of mortality. Hundreds of studies. But it gets darker. Subjects prompted with thoughts of death were much more willing than control groups to physically hurt someone who disagreed with them in politics or religion. And it gets even darker. Researchers at the University of Alberta asked devoutly Christian participants to read either a non-threatening article about the Northern Lights or an actual article titled Islam Poised to Swallow Jesus' Boyhood Home. They then had half of all participants also read about a plane crash in which 117 devout Muslims died on the way to a pilgrimage site. Okay, so some read that additional article and some did not. And then everyone in the study was given a word stem completion task to measure how readily death thoughts came to mind. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with word stem completion, but this is a very clever way at getting at the accessibility of concepts in the mind. What is present in your mind at a given moment. They will give you 3 letters that are the start of many possible words. And then they simply ask you to complete the word. So maybe you'll have 50 letters in a word stem completion task. And maybe one of the sets is COF. So you see COF and you have to finish it. And a lot of people will look at it and say coffee. But if death is in your head, you'll have a tendency to say coffin, right? GRA, you might say grand or grape, unless death is in your head, and then you say grave, right? So they can actually tell which of the cohort, which of the tested people have more mortality salience in the moment through these word stem completion tasks. So all the participants did it, and not surprisingly, the Christians who had just read Islam Poised to Swallow Jesus' Boyhood Home had much higher levels of death thoughts than those who read about the Northern Lights. Their religious culture, a key hedge against mortality salience, was under attack. But here's the scary part. Here's the real darkness for me. Those who also read that Muslims had died in a plane crash had their level of death thoughts reduced. Their death anxiety went down to the same level of those who simply read about the Northern Lights. It actually made them less anxious about their own death when they heard about the death of evildoers. So for most people, you hear about a plane crash and it's going to be a massive death prompt. It's going to drive your death anxiety up. You're going to picture yourself in that situation, right? You can expect it to raise your mortality salience, but the death anxiety of these Christian subjects was relieved, actually relieved by the death of those they saw as evildoers. They felt better. Now, my guess is that a lot of people in this room have done what I've done in terms of the contemplation of death, right? This tends to be a group that has confronted that question and done a lot more thinking about it than most people. I've been working on it for 50 years since my dad died when I was 13 years old. That sort of brought it all to the fore, and it's been a quest of mine to find everything that's ever been thought about death and to think of it as much as I could. And I understand, as I am certain you do, that death is nothing to fear because death is literally nothing, right? It's the absence of experience. But we are also all advocates of the explanatory power of evolution, right? And we know that the fear of immediate danger has been a crucial adaptive trait for our ancestors. Those with a tendency to be nonchalant about death would have been eliminated pretty quickly. But if you combine the adaptive fear of death with awareness that we will all die someday, that's an unacceptable situation. It's just not okay to the conscious mind, right? And now I know, consciously, I have brought myself to a place where I am entirely fine with death. I am willing to say that I am not only, we were talking about this before, not only am I fine with death, but I actually think it's better. I prefer it to the idea of eternal life. Eternal life kind of icks me out, you know. I'm tired. Yeah. At some point, I'd like to take the nap. So I have intellectualized the living shit out of death. It's absolutely true. I've read every argument and reflection. I've stared at dead animals and people, forcing my mind to grasp the condition. I've spent untold hours in cemeteries. I read autopsy accounts for fun. I've read books like How We Die, absolutely amazing book. And The Denial of Death, which I'll talk about in the middle in a minute, and The Worm at the Core, The Role of Death in Life, and Stiff, The Curious Life of Human Cadavers. And a particularly weird book called Being Dead, which is written from the perspective of two murdered corpses decaying on a beach, describing their own dissolution. Absolutely the weirdest book I've ever read, and it's fascinating. And then Michel de Montaigne's description of how a near-death experience after he was thrown from a horse helped loosen the grip that the fear of mortality had on him. Now, Montaigne has possibly been the greatest influence on me in terms of thinking about death, Montaigne, the French philosopher. So he was out riding. Another horse collided into his. He was thrown from the horse, thrown to the ground, so completely insensate that his friends thought he was dead, and they carried his body back to his house. But he recalled later, because he came to 2 hours later, and he recalled, quote, "It seemed to me that my life was hanging only on my lips, and I shut my eyes to help push it out, taking a kind of pleasure in languishing and letting myself go. It was a languor that gave me extraordinary sweetness. I felt myself slipping away very gently." He goes on to say that the idea of going on to death seemed easier and sweeter and more natural than going back to the vigor of life from that point. And so he later reflected that he had the greatest anxiety about death when he was furthest from that condition, when he was young and healthy. That's when he was most afraid of death. And that as he aged, or whenever he became ill, he felt a growing disdain for life. And he said it was a great revelation to him that when you contemplate death as a healthy person, there's a terror in it. But when you approach it, and as your body starts to give up, it will be a much more natural thing because it's a much shorter distance. This makes me hope that the farther I get from life and the nearer to death, the more easily I shall accept the exchange. It's a great line. So as a result of insights like that and my study of religion and psychology and anthropology and philosophy, I'm just about as far along in conquering the fear of death as I could be. And yet, on the freeway, when a car swerves into my lane, a jolt of terror goes through me. Why? If death is fine, why the jolt of terror? Well, it's because all my work on death is a work on my conscious mind, right? I've intellectualized it, but that has no real influence on the subconscious evolved fear. How could it? It's a failure to understand the power of evolved tendencies, to think that I could somehow think my way out of something that has been implanted in me in that way. So it takes very little to make that subconscious fear salient. That's the point. Conscious. We've all got it. Now, fortunately, I'm in a privileged group with specific buffers that keep that fear from overwhelming my conscious mind, right? Allowing me to live a normal life in the valley of the shadow of death. Education is helpful. Having enough money to be secure. Having physical security, physical safety. All these are things that, having been raised in a non-authoritarian household, there are things that can help put me in a position to not be subject to the terror of mortality salience, right? But not everyone has those advantages. Now, this is about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I gave a talk about what I called two-speed evolution in this very room. I don't know if anybody remembers that one, but two-speed evolution is the reason that some people don't have the same protections that I have. So here's the nutshell. Biological evolution moves achingly slowly. Our minds and bodies are essentially the same now as they were 100,000 years ago, right? There's essentially no real difference. But cultural evolution has moved really rapidly, creating this terrifying alien world for us to live in. It is not at all helpful that we were evolved for a world that doesn't match the world we live in. So the result is what's called an evolutionary mismatch. We now operate in these vast, abstract, hyper-connected systems that freak us out. We have too many inputs. We are too aware of tragedy and death all around the world. Our nervous systems aren't designed to deal with that. We live in these dense, diverse communities that we have evolved to fear. And some of us are privileged by education, financial and social stability, experience with diversity. Those resources help us navigate the mismatch. Others lack those tools. We are surrounded by people who don't have the same tools that many of us have to deal with this evolutionary mismatch. We're all living outside of the world for which we were adapted, and we are all afraid of death. But those who lack the resources to adapt to this strange world, usually through no fault of their own, by the way, are going to be much more subject to mortality salience than the rest of us. And terror management theory suggests that they are going to be much more suggestible, much more subject to influences that bring that salience further into consciousness, driving them toward nationalism, racism, fear of outgroups, embrace of categories, and even the desire that those unlike them suffer and die. Now we can go to the current unpleasantness. When I look at MAGA now, I see two cohorts. On one side, there are people struggling with the same existential terror that I've got, but without some of the resources that I have to manage the terror. And then on the other side, the second cohort, I see an ecosystem of grifters, untroubled by empathy, motivated by greed and power, two specific defenses against their own mortality salience, right? Who are willing to press those exact buttons in their fellow humans again and again to keep them afraid and turning to behaviors that can be turned into money and power. Now think of how the messaging serves first as triggers for mortality salience and then as relief. So you get them afraid, and then you offer the solution. The nation is in decline. Cultural traditions are under assault. The borders are open, and violent foreigners are pouring in. Crime is rising. Our political opponents are lunatics, corrupting the nation, blurring the lines between man and woman, destroying the sanctity of marriage. But we will elevate a strong, decisive leader to make America great again. Restore law and order, secure the borders, prioritize the in-group. You're just talking about make us a Christian nation under God again. Defend children and tradition. And he, by the way, deals with his own mortality salience by hoarding wealth and power, killing evildoers, slapping his name on things, right? And building monuments to himself. Those are all right out of the textbook for TMT. For those who are stuck on the wrong side of the gap between biology and culture, pummeled by messaging to keep them afraid, hope and joy have no power. When you think back to the Democratic campaign, which made so many of us, I'm not going to speak for everyone, but it made me feel wonderful to see all the smiles and the hope and the joy, and to have these arenas full of people talking about compassion and dignity and empathy for others. Hope and joy to someone in the midst of mortality salience feels like denial. It feels unsafe. It feels like you're not seeing what's right there. Remember how Muslims dying in a plane crash lowered the mortality salience of devout Christians? Now think of how missiles slamming into Tehran or Gaza, or bullets slamming into leftists in Minnesota don't just fail to bother them, but make them feel better. Actually makes them feel better. This is why we try to have conversation. It feels like we're speaking two completely different languages. It's because the same thing that horrifies us isn't just going past them. It's not just not noticed by them. It actually is a balm. It makes them feel better. So, what difference does it make? What difference does all this make, knowing that all this, knowing all this about the role of death in life. Well, mortality salience brings out the worst in us. This thing that we all have brings out the worst in us. Think of Germany after the Treaty of Versailles and how that moment would have raised mortality salience in Germans, among Germans, the feeling that their civilization, their culture was being obliterated. Russia after the Cold War, the South after the Civil War. In every case, there was a feeling of a lost civilization, of a loss of identity that could then be capitalized on by those grifters, by the people who hoard wealth and power, right? Now think about how living in a circle of 20 hostile military bases since the 1980s would have raised the mortality salience in Iran, helping to create this toxic, repressive, fundamentalist regime. And then there's MAGA. In each case, you have a group of people who's made to feel a loss of status, a threat to cultural identity, right? The very things that bring death awareness to the forefront. And in every case, it was followed by an attempt to burn the world down in each one of those cases. I think one of the best things we can do is build into the way that we act in the world an awareness of the problem of mortality salience, an awareness that everywhere we look, everyone we know is dealing with this on different levels, and that there can be situations that are created that bring that to the fore, especially in groups of people, and unleash a conflagration in the way that we're seeing now. So instead of battling bad guys and then dusting off our hands and declaring victory and walking away, we should anticipate what happens next to the other side. It's the difference between the punitive Treaty of Versailles and the Marshall Plan after World War II. We could cultivate empathy for those who are more exposed to mortality salience, not because it's nice, not because it's the nice thing to do, but because it might get us a better outcome. I think it's especially important for those who started from a vulnerable place and then had their exposure enhanced and manipulated, like MAGA today. That doesn't mean we hand them a match, right? Or even just stand back and watch it all burn. But understanding the ultimate causes of what's going on right now just might get us a better outcome. Okay, I want to, before I go on to questions, I want to show you the books that are the basis for these ideas if you're interested in looking into them further. The foundational text is The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, an anthropologist, 1973. It won the 1974 Pulitzer for nonfiction. This laid out the initial ideas about death awareness being at the root of nearly everything we do, nearly everything in human behavior. And 10 years later, these three young psychologists, Solomon, Greenberg, and Brzezinski, took the ideas of Becker and said, we need to make some testable hypotheses to see if the things that he's suggesting are actually supportable. And they created a framework that they called terror management theory, and ended up launching these 500 studies by researchers around the world that they then summarized in this book, this is actually the one that I read first. It's absolutely wonderful. The title is The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. And it is a riveting read. It is one of the best nonfiction books I think I've ever read in terms of introducing ideas to me that I had no idea about. But it's one of those opportunities that causes certain things to click into place that were previously baffling to me. I mean, certainly a lot of the things around MAGA and all that. But those two books I highly recommend.